All right, friends, welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, Los Angeles. Poli di Angeli, that's how you say it in Greek as well. And I wish you guys are ready for tonight. This is going to be a very, very epic show. 2 hours, two guests. Now, the second hour you've already heard before multiple times. He is the Infowars slash Alex Jones world affairs expert, Mr. Joel Skousen. And there are a ton of world news to talk about tonight. But the first guest is someone who I've been trying to come get back on this show because I did interview him a little over a year ago and I pre-recorded it, but I wanted to get him live, and here he is. The one and only Mr. William Pepper. I should say Dr. Pepper because see, I only am Dr. J because of my JD. So, Dr. Pepper, how are ya?
Fine, thank you.
So, let's tell people a little bit about your background.
you you want me to tell about my background rather
Yeah,
than
for a brief few minutes. Why not?
wow, it's been a fairly active life. The commitment has been largely into human rights, international human rights, and I did my undergraduate and initial graduate work at Columbia University. I was also a baseball and basketball player, and then went over to London for a year and came back and became involved in local uh, human rights issues and cases, although not a lawyer at that point in time. And came to know I was involved in the civil rights movement, as were many of my colleagues, and in the 60s. And in 1964, Bobby Kennedy asked me to head his campaign for the United States Senate from New York in as his chairman and citizens chairman in Westchester County, New York, which I did. I ran the campaign in that heavily Republican area in '64. Was asked to become and took the only government position I've ever had as director of the Commission on Human Rights in the city of New Rochelle, New York, which was a northern city close to burning.
Mhm.
And some of the city fathers came to me and asked me to try to do what I could do to ameliorate the anger between the races. So I worked there, was, I have to say, relatively successful for a year, but the war in Vietnam was going on throughout this period of time, and I was troubled continually by what was happening in Southeast Asia. So I left that position in '66, went to Vietnam as a journalist, and spent most of my time in the out in the country, and had experiences that I don't envy or wish upon other people in terms of becoming aware of the amount of war crimes that
Mm.
the American forces were committing
Still
against
are.
this very ancient people. And I was involved in a what amounted to a crash landing. It was a very forced landing in Pleiku, and became injured in that, and eventually had to return to Saigon, which I had avoided for the most
Oof.
part during my trip. In Saigon, it became pretty clear the amount of pain I had that I probably should try to return and have it treated properly. But I wanted to go to a leprosarium in Tay Ninh province, where there was a large leprosarium run by the National Liberation Front. And when I sought permission, and you always need facilities there, and you had to travel by aircraft for the most part, safely during that period of time. The commander who credited us as journalists uh, couldn't understand why I wanted to go to Tain In, which was controlled by the NLF. And I told him because you learn a lot about people and groups when you see how they treat the most despised and despicable amongst their people. And he didn't seem to understand that at all. And I asked him for a chopper, and he offered me a jeep.
Hmm.
When I told some of my friends about that offer, they said, "Well, Bill, it's probably time for you to go home because the last guy they gave a jeep to was found by the side of the road."
Ooh.
And I was fairly well on a marked list because although I didn't write anything when I was in the country, and I did record and I did photograph an enormous amount of material of injuries to people and burned villages and houses, things of that sort. But I didn't write anything, but they were became suspicious of me because I didn't attend the Friday Saigon briefings and I was out in the country and was not to come in. So it seemed like it was a good time to leave, and I had tipped my hand when I first early days when I came back into Saigon from the Central Highlands following the injury, and I hooked up. I was at a party, and one Vietnamese woman uh, hooked up with me at that party and kept asking me questions about what I saw and what I was thinking and feeling, and I didn't know any better. Just was honest with her, but obviously she was a plant because the next morning I was called down to Commander Madison's office and so it was suggested that maybe it was time for me to leave. That's when I made the request for the visit to Tain In. So
Would you call that a
anyway,
court martial?
no, there's no court martial. I'm not a member of the army. I was a
Okay.
journalist.
I see.
A
I see. They
journalist.
just wanted you out of there
Yeah.
because they had a plant, obviously, to have to see what you
Well,
knew.
yes. If I stayed there, I would have. They didn't trust what I would write or what I would know or anything. So I came back to the states and in '66 and published an article in Ramparts magazine called "The Children of Vietnam." It was a devastating piece, if I do say so, with photographs of burned children and tortured kids and those who lost limbs, and horrors of that sort. And the article was in Ramparts in January of 1967. King saw it and asked to meet with me, and that was my introduction to Dr. King, and he and I then became very close that last year, just the last year of his life.
Well, let me repeat that real quick for everybody. You said Dr. King. For everybody out there listening, he is, in fact, talking about MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., the Dr. King.
Yes, that's right. And we became quite close the last year of his life, and uh, he was a foundation of a poor people's movement at that time, and asked me to become involved in that and become effectively executive director of the National Conference for New Politics. I agreed to do that. He agreed to run for the presidency. He and Dr. Spock formed a ticket to run as an independent for the presidency in 1968. And we scheduled a national convention in Chicago, an NCNP national convention in Chicago. It was attended by over 5,000 delegates, and the whole purpose was to really push this movement forward for a third party anti-war peace and freedom ticket. Well, we were young and we were naive, and we didn't realize the extensive infiltration that the government had the capability of putting forward. And so the convention was, the long story short, was sabotaged. They used groups like the Blackstone Rangers to create the first Black Caucus, and that Black Caucus had only one goal, and the goal was really to disrupt the convention and to put forward resolutions that were a lot of the resolutions were anti-Semitic, and the purpose was to drive liberal Jewish money in particular away from the movement. And we didn't realize that this was a government-inspired operation, but indeed it was, and they were successful. So they defeated the ultimate purpose of the convention, and we fell back then. And Martin decided that he would focus then on mounting this poor people's campaign for a gathering of 500,000 people in Washington D.C. in the spring of 1968. So that we began to turn our attention into that toward that goal and worked very hard on it. Well, it was quite clear they're not going to let Martin bring 500,000 people to Washington because documents that I ultimately achieved in acquiring indicated that the military was concerned that if you had that group of people, of rabble-rousing radicals, anti-war, peace and freedom radicals, that there would very well likely be a a disruption that they didn't have the troops to put down. General Westmoreland wanted another 200,000 for Vietnam. He wasn't going to be given them. Didn't have them. They didn't have the troops in Washington. They were not going to let Martin King ever survive. This is with hindsight, of course. To
Which is always
to
2020.
bring that group of massive Americans, and that was the underpinning for the final assassination effort of his. Now, they killed Martin on April 4, 1968, and that really did it for me. We went to the funeral, Ben Spock and I, funeral in Atlanta, and Bobby Kennedy asked me to come up to his suite and talk about his presidential campaign, which he had announced in on the 31st of March. And I told him, no thanks, I'm through with politics. I've seen the harm that it's done and the time away from that game for a period of time. So I refused to get involved. And between 69 and after the assassination of Martin, and 78, really nine, I managed to get a law degree, get a doctorate in education, and turn my professional skills in another direction. And Ben Abernathy called me, Martin's friend, and Ralph Abernathy called me 77, 78, asked me if I would go up to the prison and interview James Earl Ray, who was the accused assassin
Mm-hmm.
of Martin. Um, I said I knew nothing about the case and I thought he was guilty. It took me several months of research to come to the conclusion that there was very serious doubt the man had never had or fair tribunal. So I agreed to do that. Interviewed him for 5 hours, after which we became quite convinced that he was innocent. but I didn't know that whether he played a role of any sort. But he was not definitely not the shooter.
Who do you think, in your personal opinion, was for Martin?
Well, I know who the shooter was. I had lunch with him within the last 18 months. But in any event, I went back and forth to Memphis, and more and more discrepancies came up, and it became quite clear to me that Ray was innocent. And it took me 10 years before he kept asking me to represent him as his lawyer. It took me 10 years. Finally, in 1988, I took on his case as his lawyer, and we went through Circuit Court of Appeals,
Hmm.
Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and tried to get to the Supreme Court, and we failed every step of the way. We were denied each step of the way, and all we wanted really was to have an evidentiary hearing where we could put on evidence that had never been heard by a court jury. So I labored
It sounds to me
with
like there was
James Earl Ray.
it sounds to me like there was a conspiracy to make sure James Earl Ray would never have a chance at appeal and never get a chance to get in SCOTUS.
Well, that's really what it was about. We managed to do a television trial in 1993. We managed to do a television trial with a federal judge sitting in as the judge, a jury chosen from all over the country. The prosecutor was Hickman Ewing, who was a former U.S. attorney and a very skilled and professional prosecutor, and I, of course, was Ray's defense counsel. We tried the case. The case itself took 10 days of trial, and it took the jury about 7.5 hours to come back and find Ray not guilty. And that was on the basis of the evidence that we had in 1993. I wrote the first book on the case in 1995. It was called Orders to Kill. The second book I wrote in 1999. Ray died in 1998 in prison. We were not successful, but the King family hooked up with me, and we became very close. And they became convinced of Ray's innocence,
Hmm.
and so they supported the effort that I mounted. And we ran a civil trial in 1999 where the defendant was one of the conspirators of the assassination, a man called Lloyd Jowers, who owned a that backed onto the Lorraine Motel where Martin was staying. I was able to box Jowers in by getting his girlfriend uh, to admit that he had told of his role in the actual killing, although he wasn't the assassin. He carried the gun into the back of his grill, broke it down, and until it was taken away after the shooting. So from 1999 to 2016, uh, the I worked with additional evidence that came forward after each of these events, and the evidence piled up more and more strongly of Ray's innocence. Still, we failed the trial that we sought to achieve, and the family and I ran the 1999 trial, and that 1999 trial had all of the evidence that we had up to that point in time, and it took the jury to civil trial. Took the jury to Ray having no involvement at all, and the governments of the United States, state of Tennessee, city of Memphis, and Mr. Jowers, Lloyd Jowers, guilty of a conspiracy. and awarded a civil judgment. Uh, the trial went on for 30 days. It's a long trial. We presented over 70 witnesses,
Wow.
and we created a record that to this day exists in the archives of the Memphis courts. So that's the history. That's the history of my work on Martin King. Um,
Well, before
After
we
that,
get to Bobby real quick, let me ask you a quick question. Do you think the CIA was possibly involved in MLK's hit?
the CIA have probably had no. They knew everything that was going on, of course, as did the president and the executive office. But in my view, they had no direct involvement. Bobby's hit, Martin's hit, was completely organized by J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson, his number two, who he would send in and out of Memphis with money and instructions to his Dixie Mafia cohorts who worked with the Memphis police and political establishment in organizing the assassination. That was a Hoover operation. And Clyde Tolson, I have photographs of Tolson meeting with the son of one of the Dixie Mafia
Hmm.
operations that carried out the killing, and a 2-day deposition of that son as to how they planned it and what that was all about. So the King, the the Martin King assassination has effectively been set forth in all of that evidence which is the final story in my view, is contained in a book called The Plot to Kill King. It's Skyhorse Publishing did it, and The Plot to Kill King. The book there's a book there's a second book was a book on the trial itself, but that deals with all the evidence. That deals with all the evidence of the trial. But The Plot to Kill King has emerged as the main book. So then, after that all expired, um, Bobby Kennedy's lawyer died, and he was without counsel for a short period of time. And I was asked by the brother of Sirhan Sirhan and others associated with that case and that assassination to consider taking it on. When I read the evidence against Bob Kennedy's killer, alleged killer, Sirhan, the evidence against him was weaker, much weaker even, than that against James Earl Ray. So I said I would take the case. So that was how I started on the Robert Kennedy matter.
Now, what do you think happened in the Ambassador Hotel, which many people here listening to this may not know that when I myself was in law school and I was living in downtown LA, right off Wilshire Boulevard, in fact, I used to cross by the Ambassador Hotel every single day until they finally tore it down and made a high school into it. And so
All
to
right.
me, it was a historical landmark, and it's just a shame it's no longer there. But were you present that that day at the Ambassador Hotel?
Oh no, no,
Okay.
no, no. No, at that point in time when Bob was actually killed, which was about 2 months after Martin was killed, I was not involved in his case. I only became involved in Bob in representing Sirhan in 2007, and that was after his lead lawyer died, and he was without counsel. Then I took on that case from 2007, and from 2007 to the present day, 2019, we have
Almost
been struggling.
2020. Yeah.
We've gone through all the courts in California and through the whole federal system. We've been denied at every level.
Jeez.
Kamala Harris was Attorney General
Mm-hmm.
at the time. I don't even believe she read any of our briefs. The briefs were so strong and so powerful that she couldn't read them without being moved. I they went to an underling who always opposed us, and we were always denied each step of the way.
Well, I'm glad Kamala Harris has just announced today that she is not running in this 2020 sham of election
Yeah,
here. Because she's
yeah,
very corrupt. She's extremely corrupt, and being here in Los Angeles and watching her make it to the Attorney General, and then, of course, the California Senator, junior senator, which she is now, I just knew she was a very shady lady. Now, tell us, okay, at present, we have Sirhan Sirhan. He's still alive, obviously, right?
yes. There was an attempt to kill him. There have been efforts of intimidation and harassment in the prison, one prison or another where he's been. And I have had to at various times intervene with the warden just to let them know someone's looking over their shoulder. He was knifed, as you probably know. He was a
Shanks.
victim of a
Yeah.
knife attack
Hmm.
fairly recently and was rushed to hospital, but he was not injured seriously. He's come out of it, but it's pretty clear there are efforts to intimidate and harass him and effectively eliminate him if they could. And James Earl Ray had the same experience in prison. They had plans more than once to try to kill him as well. But we are out of court in the United States. We filed in 1917, oh, no, 1917, 2017, sorry. We filed in 2017 a petition with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is one of the few international treaties flows from the Organization of American States that the United States is subject to. And we filed a petition for a hearing before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And we've been chasing ourselves continually, trying to trying to get that evidentiary hearing. They have just basically ignored us. They haven't denied us, but they've just ignored us. So it's not an easy matter. In fact, if any of your listeners are California lawyers and are interested in the case,
I'm talking to one right
I'm
here.
well, I'm very happy to discuss involvement because we may have a civil action that I think we might try using California lawyers bringing the action in California. So if you want to give people my email, please feel free to do that. It's WFP Intlaw 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 at TWC.com. That's WFP Intlaw at TWC.com. I'd love to hear from anybody who is independent enough counsel and would like to become involved in such a potential action. We could always use all the help
and
we
and
can
right off
get.
the top of my head, I could think of two more people, two more attorneys who are absolutely would be in very much interested in doing so.
Well, I'd love to hear from them, and if they give me their number, I'll call and speak with them. We'll see what we can do. But
So,
but we're just looking. We're frustrated. I have a colleague in Washington. I'm a member of the D.C. bar, and I have a colleague there who's been trying desperately to get the attention of the IACHR Commission, and they've been stalling and stalling. I mean, it, it's a travesty, really, and a disgrace to the Commission on Human Rights that we can't get them to move. But that's they are obviously under the influence of forces and powers who do not want this ever to come out.
There is a couple questions
Now,
for you
who's
here.
behind the killing of Bob Kennedy
Hmm.
is, another question.
Well, before we get
That's
to that, let me
that's
ask you
another
some of
issue.
these questions in the chat here. Lasha Senyak wants to know, did anyone ever threaten you because of these cases? Your life.
Oh, sure,
Hmm.
that's par for the course. I moved my first family to England in 1981.
Wow.
I had three little children at that time, and when one of them picked up a telephone, heard the threat against me, that was the final straw, and we used to be under surveillance continually. So, yes, the answer to the question is yes, but you really have to just um, be serious, watch where you go and what you do and what you eat and with whom you eat and with
Hmm.
whom you meet. You have to take the usual precautions. That's all.
Here's another question for you before we jump into the details of RFK. Why haven't the powers behind all this already killed Sirhan? Seems like it would be easy to do.
Well, it's not quite that easy, as it, because of who he is. He's a high-profile inmate. He
Hmm.
sells alone. He doesn't have a cellmate. He sells alone, and because there are, people like me who have been representing him, they know they're under a type of scrutiny. They're being watched, and if there is anything untoward, then they're a bit concerned about that. They're, the prison authorities, the correction authorities, are happy just to keep him alive until he dies. He's like 75 years
Yeah, I
old.
was going to say the poor guy's been incarcerated from jail to prison, which, by the way,
Yeah,
many people might know this, that he, at Corcoran, that's where Charles Manson was. So I'm assuming that he's in the SHU, Secure Housing Unit, right?
he's he is he's in as much protection inside the prison, but they can't control the situation totally. That's why he was stabbed recently. There is obviously some freedom of movement that he needs to have and does have, and but it's still not that easy to kill him. If they can let him die a natural death, that's mainly what they would prefer. James seemed to die a natural death, although I have a real serious question about that. But in any event, that's the game plan is to let him live out his life in prison if possible. If necessary, to kill him when an opportunity arises.
Here's the final question for you before we go into RFK. Was anyone bankrolling Hoover to do all this?
Hoover always used public funds. He used funds that he had made available to his office. He had discretionary funds that he used. He never had any problems with money. Is anyone bankrolling him personally? I don't know the answer to that, except he was very close to H.L. Hunt, the oil man. Very close to H.L. Hunt. And he used to meet with Hunt occasionally in hotels across the country from place to place. And so if anyone was helping him financially, would have been Hunt or Hunt's colleagues who were very close to Hoover and who stood for the same racist principles that he did.
Now, let's go back to Ambassador Hotel, June 6th. 1968, 51 years ago, probably 50, 51 and a half years ago, actually. Set the setting for us, especially for those like me who weren't even alive at the time.
Well, Bob Kennedy had just won the primary, and it was way toward the nomination, and that was something that was not going to be allowed. And it was projected that he would win that primary in California, and so they were ready to take him out if he won it. Now what happened was very interesting. Martin King was to have been killed in Los Angeles. Um, he, they moved the King assassination to Memphis and moved James Earl Ray and the members of the Alpha 184 hit squad that was there in Los Angeles for quite some period of time. They were there preparing and waiting for Dr. King to come in. He was due to come in to Los Angeles, and they were waiting to set him up and kill him there. But when they began to realize how significant Los Angeles was in terms of Bobby Kennedy and his victory, they couldn't obviously have two assassinations in the same city. So they moved the King assassination to Memphis, Tennessee, and a city that was also very, very much under the control of racist elements and in particular Hoover's lower class colleagues who were there. So Los Angeles was open for Bob's victory and his death. And he after the results were in and it was clear that he had won, he gave a short speech. This is all historically recorded. He gave a short speech and then was guided through the pantry kitchen. They thought they were supposedly he was being taken that way to avoid the mob of people. In fact, the pantry itself was quite crowded, and Sirhan had been designated to be the patsy for quite a period of time before that, and he was under a form of mild hypnosis at the time of the alleged killing. In fact, that is why he didn't really remember what had happened. We've had Dr. Brown of Harvard, the psychology department of Harvard, spend several hours with Sirhan and came away very clearly convinced that Sirhan was prepped psychologically, hypnotically for this killing, hypnotically and with the use of chemicals. And dropped out of sight for 2 weeks prior to the actual time frame, and remembers vaguely being in a hospital-like setting um, prior to going into back into circulation again. But he came into the ambassador, and he met up with a young woman who was attractive and who he wanted to spend time with, and she was able to follow him and lead him effectively into the pantry and put him in a particularly sensitive spot where he could observe, and they all could observe the senator as he came in. And then he was triggered at the right point in time to he had a pistol with him. He was carrying his pistol. He he was he was he was triggered at the right time to stand up and in front of Kennedy. Kennedy was never closer than about 5 to 7 feet from Sirhan, and he was in front of him and let off 2 shots from that pistol that he was holding. One shot went astray into the pantry, and another shot hit Bullshit, who was a colleague from the Teamsters working with, uh, or the auto workers rather. He was a colleague of the auto workers working with Bob Kennedy. And Paul was hit with a bullet, and he went down and went out. He fired 2 shots. Then he was grabbed pronouncedly, very forcibly, forced down the table, and he can, in robot-like fashion, he kept pulling the trigger on his eight shot revolver, and it shot bullets all over the pantry roof.
Was it a
But
22?
was it what?
The gun a 22?
It was a 22. It wasn't a revolver. It was a 22. That's right. Yes. It was a 22, and he emptied it by firing. Just kept pulling it, so he was in a state of unconsciousness, and they held him and they kept him under control. But the classic evidence is Dr. Noguchi's report, the medical examiner's autopsy report, which showed that Bob was hit with bullets fired at powder burn range from the rear and upwards. So the killer for Bob Kennedy knelt down behind him and put 2 bullets into his body. A fourth went astray through his shoulder of his coat up into the ceiling. And the death bullet, he raised his arm and put it behind his right ear and fired it in his head. That was the bullet that killed Bob Kennedy, and it was all done by someone firing at powder burn range behind him, and in an upward direction. And meanwhile, Sirhan had distracted everybody with his first 2 shots, but it's quite clear. Uh, we had a high-ranking, very talented, technological, sound person analyze all of the recordings of sound pantry, and he came away with the conclusion that about 13 bullets were fired in all um, at the time. So there was pure pandemonium. Sirhan had had started it. He was picked up. He was held down on a team table or serving table. He was he was arrested, of course, charged. No one did anything with Dr. Noguchi's report that showed that Bob was killed from the bullets that were fired in the rear.
Here's a question for you. So, was it that was it hold on. Who was it that drugged him and brainwashed him? The Hoover people and the CIA?
Well, I mean, but I don't believe this was a Hoover operation. I could be wrong about that, but I didn't see. We in our investigation, I don't know, for 12 years, we didn't find an indication that Hoover was involved. Was it an agency operation? It's very possible it was, because Bob had alienated them, and there was a lot of discomfort with him, and the ruling forces of the country were not about to let Bob Kennedy become president. He had changed very much. Remember, I told you I handled his Westchester County, New York campaign in 1964. Well, the Bob Kennedy I knew in 1964 and did not like, by the way, was not the Bob Kennedy they killed in 1968. He had managed to get around the country to see shoeless children living in unheated homes, getting barely any education at all, malnutrition, besetting all of them. He had seen he had seen problems in America that he never knew about, being a rich young man when he first entered politics, and that turned him around. He struck his conscience, and he became determined to do something about the unequal distribution of wealth in the country. And that, of course, was not to be allowed by the ruling forces, who used uh, their connections and their power into into government itself.
There's another question here for you. Is there any legit video or photos of the event?
Oh yes, there are. In fact, when June 6th and the beginning of June comes along, you will see them, I'm sure, on CNN and some of the cable networks will YouTube will have them on. I imagine one or another. Yes, there are films of the pantry, of him, of the senator going through the pantry. How revealing they are is not really clear. One young man who took photographs had his camera taken away.
Ooh.
He had to go. He had to go to court to get it back. Years later, he eventually did get it back. But I'm not sure that the film was
I was just gonna say I
done.
doubt the film was in there. It would make
Yeah,
sense. Why would they confiscate the camera, give the
that's
camera back, and then give the film back? No.
yeah. I don't know. I don't know about the disorientation of the film. But I can tell you that there is a lot of eyewitness evidence that is available that has never been heard by a court. And the autopsy report itself by Gucci is powerful evidence of the killing of Senator Kennedy. And all we need and have needed is just a formal forum where we can present that evidence under oath. And that's what the struggle has been.
Here's another question for you, sir. Who
Well, sorry, we have these gaps every once in a while. Hello, hello, hello. Have I lost you? Hello. 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 Silence for quite a while.
Okay, good, good. Yeah, I was very curious about that because I was speaking to you. Anyhow, nonetheless, we have, about 6 minutes left. We can go over a few minutes, of course, by all means. Now, okay, we know Mr. Sirhan Sirhan will eventually pass of natural causes. He doesn't have much time left, and spending 51 years in I would guess solitary confinement in one of the worst prisons in California, which is Corcoran, where, like I said, Charles Manson was. What can we do now? You mentioned if I can grab a couple more lawyers, which I know I can, and to try to solve this once and for all and to free this man once and for all. Now, you conceded that the shots came from him, but he didn't know what he was doing, right?
The shots didn't come from him.
They didn't.
Two shots came from him. From when he was standing in front of the senator. But shots those shots were mainly to distract. The fatal shots came from the rear at Powderbird Range, where the gunman put his gun up against the senator's back and then behind the senator's ear.
Oh, so it's not just that he's innocent by way of hypnosis or something else. He
No, no,
really
no.
did not fire the shots that hit Bobby.
Oh no, absolutely not. He was never closer to Senator Kennedy than like 5 feet, between 5 and 7 feet in the front facing him. Senator Kennedy was not hit with any bullets in the front. He was hit with bullets from the rear in his back and behind his ear.
Well, we do know that the mobsters, Teamsters even, Jimmy Hoffa, whoever you may call it, the five families in New York, the Midwest Mafia families, they did not want Bobby Kennedy to be POTUS.
No, that's true.
What's your inference on who was the person behind him firing those fatal shots behind Bobby?
He was a pro, and he was probably someone who had been used by one or another of the government agencies for various types of assassinations over the years.
Wow.
He was he was a professional.
That's just really sad. Well, I hope before he passes away and before your legacy finishes that we are able to resolve this once and for all and catch the killer. I'm sure you heard of the DB Cooper case, the skyjacking in 1971.
Yes,
We
yes,
finally found out
yes.
who he was. I don't have the name in front of me, but he was a CIA asset. That's why he was never brought to charge. So that's what I'm thinking is maybe a possibility here. Maybe if it was a mobster, they were closely related to the agency, or maybe it was a hitman from the agency or something like that because like you said, he was a pro.
Yes, no
Now,
question about that.
we have a couple minutes left, and of course, I'm going to ask you to repeat your email address, and I have it, of course, which I'm going to email my attorney friends at the end of the night. And I don't want to wake you up in about an hour and 20 minutes to properly thank you, and I will thank you today, and I'll probably call you tomorrow just to thank you for this tonight. What else do you think we should know about this story?
Well, I think it's important to draw some lessons from all of those assassinations in the 60s. And I think the main lesson is that there are ruling forces in the country. There are corporate and other ruling forces, and they have very great influence with some of the major governmental agencies. And it's very important to understand that people who are dissenters, troublemakers, are allowed to do that, and they are used as foils because it can be alleged that, as they have done with me, by the way, many times, that speech, and they're allowed to do interviews, and they're allowed to write books. The books are not reviewed. None of my books have been reviewed, by the way. But there are people. They can maintain the structure maintains that all the freedoms are available
Mm-hmm.
because this is a democratic republic. But what is really much more insidious is the fact that they're suppressed from the mainstream, and public education in America has drastically failed the people of this country. And it's a question of what the ultimate outcome is going to be in terms of democracy. Just look
Agreed.
around you and consider what's happening now and what will happen in 2020. We have not ever properly educated our population to be critical thinkers. And as a result, they have fallen in line over many years. And these kinds of events are given a kind of tabloid, and they're effective. And that's the history that they write. People like me write an alternate history, and often with very strong factual basis, but it's not read, it's not understood, and it's not digested by the population at large.
Well, this
And
is
that is
one of the
unfortunate.
purposes of this interview was to make sure that people are reading what you have written because that alternate history with factual evidence may in fact be the real history that because I
Well,
know the
I would hope so. I would hope.
Now, before I let you go for the next guest, you already said your email, and I'm going to ask you for a final statement. Like I said, I'll call you tomorrow or the next day to properly thank you since I do have to go to the next guest. Can you tell your email one more time because that is one of the questions?
Sure. It's W for William, W F for Francis, P for Pepper, WFP, int law, INTLAW, int law, WFP, int law at TWC, Time Warner Cable, TWC.com.
Well said. If you have one final statement for everyone out there, what would it be?
It would be question everything you're being told by government, question everything you're being told by mass media, and don't lull yourself into sleep in believing everything that the progressive media, which is increasingly infiltrated, that the progressive media just think critically, ask questions, and you will be much further along on the road to truth about any issue.
Mr. Pepper, it has been a true pleasure having you on here live with the chat room with people really asking you questions. They're very engaged, unlike the time when I did record you one on one with no one around to participate in this. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you join us soon again soon.
Thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, well, God bless you and keep up the strong
Good
fight,
night.
and I'll be in touch with you very soon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.
Thank you, Mr. Pepper. Good night. All right, folks. Now we are about to switch to the second guest. He used to come on here fairly often, but then I became backed up. Well, it's 50 plus guests, but really that ain't so. 50 plus guests need to be rescheduled, but that doesn't include people that I have already had in mind, like Graham Hancock, David Paulides. And so, if you really want to add up the amount of guests that I have, which is a good problem, I could tell you this: a lot of people could not find guests for their shows, and I just never have I have a never-ending stream of great guests. Who you just heard, Dr. William Pepper, is the real deal. This guy knew Martin Luther fucking King and represented Sirhan Sirhan. It doesn't get any more real than that. Now, let's get into the second half of the show. Let me make sure I got the number properly here so I can call him and it's not a big screw up here. And I think it's so. Let's see if we could bring in Mr. Joel Skousen now. Let's find out, folks. Hang tight.
Hello, this is Joel.
Mr. Joel, we are live on air. Welcome back.
Good to be with you, Dr. J.
Well, it's always a pleasure to speak to you and always a pleasure to check out the World Affairs Brief that you write weekly because you have so much information. And at the end of this show, I'd love for you to plug that in because I guarantee more people will be interested in subscribing to this. I think we should jump right in to a very important topic, and then of course everything else you want to tell us tonight would be great, and of course questions that'll come across in the chat, I will, I'll direct them your way. What is going on with the leftist deep state impeachment crap?
Well, it's a not so very sophisticated attack on the presidency, and they want gone. And let me just say that they put out their Chairman Schiff put out his report today, and it was skewed to the extreme. For example, they make the case that in general that that President Trump abused his power by using pressure on Ukraine for purely political purposes.
Quid pro quo.
On its face,
yeah.
This sounds like it's horrible that a president would put pressure on a country to, and they even couched it in other words which are even worse, which is to invite interference in our election. Now,
which we know Hillary did via Christopher Steele. Yeah.
But first of all, this is great hypocrisy. The U.S. interferes in everybody else's election. They use NSA spying to get dirt on all candidates in every country. And if they want to take them down, like they did to the Freedom Party candidate, who was not candidate, but who was actually part of the actual government of Austria, and aired his, getting caught in a honey trap set up by the CIA to entice him into a sexual encounter. And, they blew him out of water. It was clearly NSA interference in another election. They did the same in Colombia with Montesinos, who was a CIA plant within the Peruvian government, and they gave him dirt on his opposition so that he could expose them for other crimes. But that's direct interference in the election. Now, here's the point, and this is a very, very important point that unfortunately the White House is missing, in the sense that they should be defending this entire procedure on the merits. And these are the merits that, one, there was a treaty between the United States and Ukraine signed during the Obama administration that specifically obligates Ukraine to help the U.S. in any investigation of corruption that the U.S. requests. And that's exactly what Donald Trump is doing. Number two is that Joe Biden has admitted in an open video before a CFR audience that he used extreme pressure to withhold $1 billion unless the Ukraine fired a certain prosecutor that was after his son's involvement in the corrupt energy company Burisma.
That's right.
Burisma. And
let me just say this: Biden brags about this.
Black
But Biden literally brags about this. He says, "Well, son of a bitch, they fired an attorney, they fired him, and they put someone proper in place." He brags about this.
Yeah. Not only that, he told President Poroshenko, "I'm going to be leaving. My plane leaves in 6 hours, and if he isn't fired by the time I leave, you're not getting the $1 billion." Those were his exact words. Sindra of NPR, black correspondent lady, had the audacity, after airing a video, airing his Ohio speech to his supporters saying that Biden is guilty of to corruption in Ukraine and the firing of a prosecutor. She had the audacity to say, what Trump just said here, there is no evidence of. No evidence. I mean, we have his open commission. We have his open admission to a CFR audience. We have it on videotape. Everybody who hasn't seen it ought to Google, or not Google, use DuckDuckGo because Google may filter it out. But,
Yeah, DuckDuckGo is actually secure.
Biden, admitting to Ukraine pressure. The point is this, and this can be defended on its merits. They couch the fact that Trump had a quid pro involved in investigating a political opponent. Now, it happens to be that Biden is a political opponent. But the inference of that objection by the Democrats is that if you are a political opponent of the president, you are immune from investigation. That's the implication. If you make that a rule that you cannot investigate a political opponent lest we call it purely political, the point is there are dual things. It happens to be true that this would accrue to Trump's favor if Biden were convicted of corruption. But the point is, President Trump has a fiduciary responsibility to investigate corruption, especially in Ukraine, which is a holdover from the old former Soviet states, is full of corruption. I have documented in the World Affairs Brief many, many times since 1990 that the Soviet Union was a carefully crafted deception, that the Communist Party simply went underground. They mandated that communist leaders resign from the country. What a protest from the, in fact, they gave the go-ahead, for example, where these university students started this whole, uprising against the Soviet Union. They gave the go-ahead to the Stasi not to arrest any of these student leaders, and kind of hinted at them that you can go ahead. The Stasi's going to be okay with this.
Jeez.
Erich Honecker, on his deathbed, told journalists that he got orders from Moscow to let the Leipzig riots go forward. Now, that means that they manufactured their own fall in order to get Western aid and trade, which they did in abundance. But the point is this: none of the former Soviet states fired or relieved any of the bureaucrats. All of those communists in the bureau kept their jobs, and they kept taking bribes just like before. In fact, several of the leaders of the so-called free Western countries, like in Poland, Václav Havel and Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, and the leader of Solidarity in Poland, we now know through agents that came out of the Soviet Union that these were agents of the Soviet Union masquerading as freedom fighters, so that you could lure in people and find out and tell the Stasi and the other, security services who were the real conservatives there. And so these people are masquerading as freedom fighters. And I visited Poland and even talked to some people. I said, "Did you know that Lech Walesa of Solidarity was a Soviet?" "Oh yeah, everybody here knows that." Everybody here knows that. But in the United States, do they know that? No, because there's a filter on the news. But getting back to the impeachment, you have a fiduciary responsibility to investigate corruption, even if it's a political opponent. And the way that this is being written up and handed to the judiciary, this is a pure 100% political motive. And it's false on all counts. One, and it's not false that there was a quid pro quo. That can be defended on the merits. All foreign aid has a quid pro quo.
Yeah, it's essentially a contract without
you can prove
writing.
That going back decades. There's always quid pro quo for foreign
centuries.
aid. And there's always a scrutiny.
Yeah, centuries.
Right. So you can defend that. You can defend that on the merits. You can also defend the fact that there was no pressure. I mean, if you listen to that transcript and that call with President Zelensky of Ukraine, this guy's a lapdog to Donald Trump. He views Donald Trump as his mentor. Anything you want, Mr. President, I'll be happy to do. Not at all. So there's no pressure. There is a quid pro quo, and unfortunately, Donald Trump has gotten into denial. By denying that there's a quid pro quo, he's gone out on a long limb. This is a bad defense tactic. Gone out on a long limb saying, I did not instruct to do this quid pro quo in Ukraine. But he actually said so in the transcript. I mean, that's what makes it such a terrible deny. He said, I'm sending Giuliani, he talked about what he wanted. He wanted to the CrowdStrike interference on election and Biden dealings with Burisma. He says, I'm sending Giuliani to discuss these issues with you.
As long as with William Barr as well.
So I'm saying, you see, that's right. You see, he's got off on the wrong foot by denying that there was any quid pro quo. He should have defended it. And number two, denying that he ever told Rudy Giuliani. When you look at Ambassador Sondland's testimony, he's come across as an honor. Yeah, all from Rudy Giuliani. Did you hear it from Donald Trump? No, not at all. Did he ever mention quid pro quo when you talk about it? No, not at all. But he did get it from Rudy Giuliani. And Rudy Giuliani, had 40 or 50 phone calls with people in Ukraine. So he was clearly carrying the message. So this makes President Trump look bad, even though there's no crime involved. He's just not defending it properly. And I have yet to hear the White House ever utter anything about Joe Biden, proof of this actual corruption. You see, if they defended this on the merits about quid pro quo and the legitimacy of investigating and making contingent on Ukraine corruption or lack of corruption because it's endemic there, if you defended on that and said, and we do have proof of the corruption that we're investigating in Joe Biden's admission, and that was the Democrats to have to counter Joe Biden's corruption publicly. If the White House made that main defense issue, we are investigating on that because he does not have immunity, even though he's a political. They're hurt by that? No. They are not defending this thing properly on the merits, and it's not going to go well.
Now, yet the Senate says unequivocally that they will acquit Donald Trump in the impeachment trial in the Senate.
Yeah, and I think that they will. Although there's about 35 rhino Republicans.
Yeah, like Mitt Romney, the never Trumpers, yeah.
So, this has the potential of being very bad for the Democrats, shooting themselves in the foot. But look at what they've done. In this entire campaign, you got 20-some-odd candidates for president against Donald Trump, who are all going to the extreme left, Medicare, free money, free jobs, and who's going to pay for it? Let's not discuss that.
Yeah, but $54 trillion out of our pocket.
They're all shooting themselves in the foot.
Let me ask you a question here. We obviously had the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Communism fell, then became the Republic of Russia. And now what are the left doing? They want to adopt Marxism?
They want to adopt what?
Marxism. Karl Marx. Marxism.
Well, they've never given up in the universities. They're Marxism. But remember, communism never fell on the Soviet. It just went underground. And so, and let me give you a little background here. The original oligarchs that rose up, heads of, had become rich through buying up Gazprom and the oil companies, and Brzezinski bought up the media empire, etc. These were all of the original secret communist leaders over the Politburo, because Gorbachev had been appointed to the Politburo as head of the Soviet Union. Only 2 years before that, he'd been a mid-level bureaucrat, an arms negotiator. How do you get in the Soviet Union, where you normally have to kill people to get to the top, how do you get from a mid-level arms negotiator to the top without killing anybody? It's because there's a powerful group of people behind the scenes that were actually running the show. The Politburo was just there for facade. Well, guess who becomes head of the Commonwealth of Independent States after the phony fall? Boris Berezovsky. Well, it's interesting that Boris Berezovsky and Gruzinski and all the other original oligarchs, the proof that they were the original underground communist leaders that were running the Politburo is that they instructed the Central Bank of Russia to lend them the money to buy all of these industries. Who else could have got the central bank to loan them the money so that they could become oligarchs? What the central bank realized were the original communist leaders. And after he was named head of the Commonwealth of Independent States, and Yeltsin the drunk, was a figurehead president, one of the insiders in the Kremlin said he saw in a meeting where all of the heads of state were meeting with Yeltsin, he saw Yeltsin step aside and let Berezovsky enter the room first. And in Russian hierarchy, that means that Berezovsky was over Yeltsin. So that's more proof that the Soviet Union never felt that the original oligarchs were, in fact, the original communist leaders who made themselves rich and enriched themselves. Now, Yeltsin had to go because he was a drunk and he was incompetent.
Drunk and singing.
They brought in
That's
Vladimir Putin from the KGB.
Mm-hmm.
They brought in Vladimir Putin from the KGB. Well, Vladimir Putin ended up overthrowing the original oligarchs. He had Berezovsky killed. He exiled Gruzinski. He had Khodorkovsky of the Yukos Oil Company imprisoned and jailed. And basically what he did, he picked a whole new group of oligarchs to rise up with a contract with him that he would get a cut of about 4% of their income for him protecting them as his own oligarchs. So what we started out with was the original oligarchy of communist leaders making themselves wealthy. Now we have a strongman again, like Stalin. Putin has overthrown the others by force and got his other new. I mean, this Sochi palace, gold-plated palace, really does belong to Putin. He's probably the wealthiest man in the world because of this cut that he's getting. So even though the Russian, communism has appeared to fall, it is still preparing to attack the West, and that's been one of my long-term messages, that together with China, they intend to strike the West at some point once their first-line weapons get built. But going back to Donald Trump, the purpose of removing Trump is a deep state purpose. Donald Trump, even though he has gone along and unfortunately made some bad compromises, I mean, almost everything on foreign policies he's compromised on, whether the attacking Syria, blaming it for the chemical weapons, which they did not do. It was the U.S.-backed rebels that did it. But you see, Donald Trump came into the White House without understanding the deep state. He claims he's going to drain the swamp, but he can't tell who's deep state and who isn't. He kicks out James Comey, who's deep state, and then replaces him with Christopher Wray, who's also deep state. He was involved with Robert Mueller in the cover-up of the 9/11, which was a deep state operation from beginning to end. He picks Brett Kavanaugh to be the Supreme Court, who was deep state because he was the number 2 to Ken Starr in covering up for the Vince Foster murder, claiming that it was a suicide. You have to be deep state to cover up the kind of evidence that they had that it was a murder, not a suicide. Gorsuch is not deep state, is what we can tell. He did okay in that choice. But William Barr, who's feigning loyalty to Donald Trump, has refused to prosecute Comey. And Michael Horowitz, the OIG, Office of Inspector General, is also a deep stater. He's claiming to undercover this stuff, but he always covers for them. And Bill Barr never prosecutes. And Bill Barr never released the classified documents that Congress wanted because Trump, who had the power to, said, I'm just turning this over to Bill Barr. I trust him. And Barr kept it secret. Bill Barr, the handler of George H.W. Bush.
Thank you. You just beat me to what I was just about to say. Wasn't he also the Attorney General under George Herbert Walker Bush?
That's right. He covered up for Iran Gate. He covered up for Iran Contra. He covered up for all the smuggling coming in through the sea, across our border. All of that was covered up by A.G. Barr. So he's playing it pretty smart. Trump thinks he's loyal to him, but I don't think we're going to see any prosecution of Hillary Clinton, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, Page, any of these people. I
Well,
don't think that
unfortunately, just like I agree with you, and the reason is Roger Stone last year, long before he was indicted and then sadly convicted, and is facing 50 years. I mean, the maker of Kings, it just saddens me. He told me that Trump would be doing such a better job if he wasn't surrounded by Democrats in the Oval.
But whose fault is that?
Trump's.
Trump came into office having never been a conservative, having known no conservatives. How do you choose 4,000 staff the White House if you don't know anybody? And he didn't. And so you go to the Republican National Committee and you ask them to pick it, and they pick a bunch of deep staters. I mean, not only did the FBI have one spy, they had a whole household of spies in the White House.
That's right. That's right.
Proven by Lieutenant Colonel Vindman calling, China, the CIA and blowing the whistle on this stuff. I mean, they've got more spies in there than they've got allies of Donald Trump. And so how can you win? So they keep Donald Trump pretty well surrounded. He doesn't do any homework on his own except watch TV. So if it doesn't get on Fox News, and they'll never talk about conspiracy on Fox News. If it's not on Fox News, he will not find out about it.
Now, you remember, okay, I don't know who it was that said this, but he was in a crowded restaurant sitting across the table from Ambassador Gordon Sondland and heard President Trump calling Ambassador Sondland. The phone was not on speaker, and he alleges that he heard a quid pro quo. Who was this?
Gee, his name has slipped my mind. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But
The point is,
story.
he just testified the same day as Dr. Fiona Hill, it was just such a sham what Adam Schiff
But the point is, Sondland does claim that he got it from Rudy Giuliani, and that's enough, because Rudy Giuliani obviously got it to the president. The president's attorney doesn't make something up on his own, and Trump was saying he was doing this on his own. That's just not believable. As I say, it goes back to the root cause. Defend the quid pro quo on the merits. Don't try to deny it. And he'd be fine. Because part of defending on the merit is making an issue of the fact that Biden is corrupt. We have the proof, and he's going down for it. I don't care if he's a political opponent or not. I have a responsibility.
Now, let me ask you something we talked about last time, and for a few times, that the deep state is allowing a small nuclear device to be detonated somewhere here in mainland United States via China and Russia. What's the status on that?
Well, I don't think he remembered quite well. I'm talking about a massive preemptive strike on the U.S. military, not a single weapon. In fact, it would be preempted or be preceded by an EMP strike on the nation, which takes at least 6 high-altitude nuclear weapons to blanket the entire grid.
And that would literally shut off all our electricity and everything.
That's right. The electricity is going down within 15, 20 minutes, and you have a physical strike on U.S. military targets. Now, what's the basis for my assumption on that? It's Presidential Decision Directive 60. This is still top secret, signed in 1997 by President Bill Clinton. It was a complete revamp of our nuclear posture, where the government gave new orders to the missile forces that they were not to prepare to launch on warning, but to absorb a nuclear first strike and then retaliate afterwards. Now let that sink in.
They're allowing a preemptive strike to come in so they could absorb it.
Yeah, I mean, talk about an invitation to a first strike when the Russians and China. Now, I happen to know because they've listened to my interviews around the world for the past 10 or 15 years, and they know about PD-60. But I found out that they don't believe it.
Well, we know China's being extremely hostile,
I
taking over
thought,
Hong
and so
Kong.
they're preparing.
Yeah, that's right. Taking over the China Peninsula, the sea near them. They're doing whatever they can to look so outwardly like they're gonna attack us, and there's nothing we can do because they have a standing army. Correct me if I'm wrong. A standing army that is as large in population as is the entire population of the United States.
No, that's not true. But in any case, the standing army is about 200,000. I'm sorry, not, it's about 2 million total, but that's a far cry from 300 some million, people in the United States. They have a lot of reserves, they can call up, but they're not very well trained. But here's the point about Presidential Decision Directive 60. This is what the globalists want. They have to have a reason to get the Americans to accept getting into a militarized global government to defend us. And the only way that you do that is to let the U.S. military be decapitated at their military bases.
Wow.
Without warning. Without warning. And so they can't invite that strike. They can't say, strike us. But what they do is open the windows so that when Russia and China finally decide, and the U.S. is constantly provoking the world, and I'm not saying Russia and China are the good guys. They're not by any means. But the U.S. is constantly provoking everyone in the world through this military intervention around the world. And we're viewed as the bully of the world. And this is only handing to Russia and China the excuse to take down the bully of the world someday. And at the appropriate time, and I think North Korea will be a trigger event, and that's why it's a major mistake for Donald Trump to believe that Kim Jong-un is sincere when everybody knows he's not, and to allow North Korea to continue to build nuclear weapons. They will strike South Korea someday, and when the U.S. comes to the rescue and retaliates with nuclear weapons or tactical nukes at least, Russia and China will use that as a trigger to strike the United States with preemptively with the nuclear weapons at our U.S. military bases, not cities. The Russians and China do not want to destroy the American economy. What they want to do is decapitate the military and blackmail us into submission, and the U.S. deep state knows that. They have spies in Russia and China. And they intend, that's smart, they intend to use the first strike to come out of their bunkers and say, look, people, we have been struck by Russia and China. We have no means to defend ourselves now unless we join together with other Western non-communist nations in a militarized global government to prosecute this war. And who is going to say nay after you've absorbed a nuclear first strike and the grid is down? Nobody.
Nobody.
And that's how we get into a militarized global government and lose our freedom. Now, they'll still tell you you're free, but they won't let you go back, as in World War II, to national sovereignty, because I think it's my theory that the globalists will make a deal with China during Third World War to betray, just as they made a deal with Russia to betray Hitler, and thus Russia will be defeated, I predict, in World War III, and then China will be the new Cold War enemy, and that will justify the globalists saying, oh, we can't stand down our global military because we have this new Cold War enemy. And that's why we stay in a new world order. And I'll tell you, if you look at how they've set up it, you'll see how nigh into impossible it is to get out of a new world order once you're into it. They just will play every trick in the book to keep you in.
Now, Kim Jong Un, right? Why would Trump even think that he would give up his nuclear weapons when that's the only leverage he really has?
Well, it's because Kim Jong-un did agree to denuclearization in the first chapter and made Donald Trump a believer. He just wowed Donald Trump. I can tell you that Xi Jinping of China got together with Kim Jong-un before that first meeting with Donald Trump, and he told him Trump can be flattered. He can be snookered. All you got to do is lay it on him and praise him and act peaceful and nice, and he'll be a believer. Trump is not a fighter. Trump wants to make a deal at any cost. That's his success from, not to fight. And he has never been very good even financially at fighting. He always runs away and declares bankruptcy and, stiffs his clients. But Donald Trump is not used to, fighting, and he made a vow before he went to North Korea. I'm going to solve this North Korean problem one way or the other. If not diplomatically, then militarily. And he's completely negated that promise to solve it. And that's the only way you're going to solve a military problem with a communist country. Russia and China, we've allowed to get too big. You can't solve that militarily until they make the first strike. But North Korea is not too big to solve militarily before they could become the trigger event for World War III.
Wow. And knowing that this is literally coming upon us in the next few years, up to 4 years even, maybe even 5, is probably what scares me the most. I have, I'm blood military for my father. My brother's also military contractor. He's, you could kind of say he's a Snowden type. He served in the Marine Corps, and now he's a NSA CIA contractor in Kuwait. That's as much as I could say without getting him in more trouble. But the point
Sure.
is that he fears what's going to happen when he comes back here.
Well, just hope he's not in the military or at military bases.
He is. He's staying at a base that's so clandestine that he can't even tell us. And we don't know what he's working on either. Because he has, there's clearance, there's secret and top secret, which you know. He's at top secret, and he won't even acknowledge that.
Well, I'll tell you what's going on in the Middle East. The deep state, unbeknownst to Trump, and that's why they keep talking him into keeping troops there, the deep state is busy arming and supplying ISIS. The deep state created ISIS. About half the Syrian rebels that they were funding and said, you're now ISIS. It was a name change. They gave them new leaders trained by the Israeli Mossad, launched them off into Iraq and then back into Syria so they could have an excuse to stay in Syria and to fight. And that's, it was so clear. I've covered in the World Affairs Brief for years how the U.S. has saved ISIS. They sent in helicopters to rescue the leaders in Mosul. They left the whole sector open so ISIS could escape, the dragnet trying to get them. In Raqqa, when they, the Kurdish rebels and not U.S. forces, but got ISIS defeated, the U.S. paid 50 semi-trucks driven by Arab drivers to come in and rescue ISIS, their families, and their heavy weapons. And of course, where did they go? Back into Syria and reintegrated into Syrian rebels. And there are no moderate Syrian rebels. They're all jihadists. And so it really makes no difference, but they're all the U.S. and Soviet bloc weapons from arms dealers through the deep state, and they pay for it. There's a Bulgarian journalist, Dilyana Detansheva, who has documented and taken pictures of the manifests that she's found in these weapons depots with U.S. signatures on it, and it just and brought in by Silkways Airline as diplomatic cargo.
Wow.
I mean, that's how bad they're covering up for this thing. And it's all run out of the Baghdad embassy, the largest embassy in the world, and that's why we're not leaving Iraq, is because we've got this major embassy that is running all of this terrorism, arming and trafficking and money and stuff around. And so this is much worse than people think. And unfortunately, Donald Trump doesn't have a clue about what the deep state is doing because he's got nobody in the White House to tell him.
I have 2 questions for you. First, I'm going to start with a recent event in London. 2 people were stabbed to death with a terrorist who was let out after 8 years on a 16-year charge. That could have been prevented, but nonetheless, 2 people were killed. And fortunately, the suicide vest was a fakery. Why are they releasing terrorists like this back in the general population of England or wherever it be so they can commit these heinous crimes? Unless they want them to.
Yeah. Should have been deported, but they don't want to. I mean, we've got to remember they've got to keep the war on terror alive, and almost all of the terror attacks, 90 plus, are committed by agent provocateurs hired by the deep state to do so. Now, that doesn't mean that all terrorists know that, but certainly they are. Like the big French terror attack, which took down hundreds of people. They put an all-points bulletin for a Volkswagen Jetta that was supposed to be, the terrorists driving around in. But the car shot up with automatic weapons in that French terror attack, not the movie theater one, but the French restaurant, where it had military-equipped guys who were not Arab-looking, but white, come out of this Mercedes-Benz and began using automatic weapons. Get in the Mercedes, and do you think there was an all-points bulletin put out for that Mercedes? Not in your life.
No. Now this is different than the Charlie Hebdo, right?
Yes, this is different. This was the major attack on the movie or on the theater where everyone was, going to a concert, etc., and then a restaurant was shot up, and it was the largest terrorist attack in Paris. But it was typical of their thing. They dropped their passport. What terrorist carries their passport around?
Right. Seriously, I know, right?
Just like the 9/11 hijacker, they leave the names behind in their pair. And a pristine passport comes out of the World Trade
unsinged, right? Unsinged.
It's blown apart.
Yeah. Okay, next question for you. What do you think will be the effect of having al-Baghdadi blow himself up with 3 children? Will ISIS be crippled, or is this just the beginning of the people who are going to fill Mr. al-Baghdadi?
Well, they announced in the very same day that al-Baghdadi had been replaced. So what does it do?
Nothing.
Here's the point. We have no proof, any more than we do of the bin Laden special forces. I covered very carefully in the World Affairs Brief how the bin Laden thing was a fake, because bin Laden was already dead. Baghdadi has been dead for years. They've already announced his death 2 or 3 times before. But you see, that's why they falsified the DNA. They claim that they took a portable DNA type of thing. They don't explain where you got the original sample. But you see, when you dump the body at sea, as they did with bin Laden, you make sure that nobody can check your story about the DNA, etc. But I believe that was in the bin Laden, there was, the CIA had at least 2 lookalikes for bin Laden that they used for propaganda purposes. The one video taking responsibility for 9/11. That was the CIA lookalike. And I think that's one of those that they killed. I mean, are we to believe that he was under surveillance for 2 solid years in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and nobody knew or decided to take him down? I mean, this is just ridiculous. But the Baghdadi raid had all of the same markings of a falsified. Now, not that, something really didn't happen. I mean, but we're never going to know whether it's al-Baghdadi. He may still be alive for all that we know. But he may have been dead years ago. But these are propaganda purposes to keep the war on terror alive in people's minds, as if the U.S. is fighting it. Remember, Deep State runs Al-Qaeda, every major terror organization. They run it. And so when they talk about destroying the leaders, got to take it with a grain of salt.
Here's a question in the chat for you. This is from Nicholas Cashmore. What explosives were used in the 3 9/11 towers, and what hit the Pentagon?
Oh, that's a very good question. There were 2 different types of explosives used in the Twin Towers, and one type in Building 7. Typical cutting charges in Building 7. That's why it collapsed on its own footprint. Impossible to happen with a fire only on one side. Clearly explosives. But there were 2 types of charges in the World Trade Center. First of all, there were thermite or thermate charges and these are not explosive charges, but these are special powder that's poured into the middle of these 4-foot massive columns to melt them down. And there were also then cutting charges to be set off to precipitate the rest of the building collapsing when the main 47 pillars started to collapse. But you notice that if you look at one of the film of the North Tower when it comes down, you see the antennas on top slightly start to descend before the outside of the building. That's proof that the 47 main columns had been compromised at one time. Didn't start to tilt over, just come straight down.
That's right.
And if the airplane had hit only a portion of those 40, let's suppose they damaged, 10 or 11 of them, the building still would have held, and it was designed to do that. And if it did collapse, it would tilt over at that point. It wouldn't have collapsed straight down. So there were cutting charges going off all the way down. In fact, there were explosions in the second building before the plane hit. The janitor said the whole basement had blown out, from the elevator doors were blown out. All the lobby windows, when the firemen came in with their cameras rolling, blown out, even though no plane had hit the South Tower yet. That is proof that there were explosives in it. But two types: thermite to melt down the cut charges to keep the building going at free fall speed. Now, plane 77.
Also, okay, go on with that.
So Flight 77 is one of the most complex of all the operations in 9/11. I mean, the plane that hit I think all of these planes were modified and remote control airplane, not the ones with the passengers on them. For example, the one that hit the South Tower, when it flips up and makes that turn toward the South Tower, you can see a bulging modification on it. I called Boeing when that happened. I said, who made the modification, and did you authorize it? And they said, they didn't deny there was one, like the news media is saying, oh, you're just seeing the wheel wells. No, sir, this is a modification. A bulging, probably loaded with fuel to accelerate the damage. And they said, Boeing told me we didn't do it. They didn't say it did. There was no modification. They said, we didn't do it. Now, that's illegal, except for government. Government's the only one that could do that. Terrorists couldn't have done that. And no pilot would have walked around that airplane as they have to do before they accept an airplane.
What about the Pentagon? Because some people, if you see the footage, it looked like a Tomahawk with like Cessna wings.
All right. Well, no, it really doesn't. I mean, that's a long distance away, the camera. And I think it was a full-size airplane. Now, that airplane had to be modified. That airplane will not go at 500 miles an hour and make a turn, which would be at least 5 or 6 Gs, without the wings pulling off. Had to be a specially modified aircraft, large size. And it also had to be loaded with explosives, not just a bomb in the baggage department. And I'll explain why. When the plane came in and hit the Pentagon, one of the witnesses said, this is very credible, he says, the plane hit the Pentagon wall and the wall held up like a champ, and then the airplane exploded. Now, this matches everything that happened. First of all, it explains why there isn't a lot of wreckage in there, but it explains another thing. I mean, why there's only confetti-sized pieces of that airplane all over the lawn and parking lot.
And no bodies in lawn and suitcases or anything.
The only way that you could explode a plane like that is to have it, especially those massive wing beams, etc., is to have the whole wing and fuselage loaded with explosive. A bomb in one portion would leave huge chunks of the airplane. So it had to be loaded with explosives. Terrorists couldn't have done that. They couldn't have modified the airplane with more powerful engines, stronger wings, etc., to do this, or have put in remote control equipment. All of these airplanes, by the way, because pilots from 9/11 Truth, we saw the radar tapes, and you see the planes from Boston Logan and Dulles go out towards the Midwest, and they rendezvous with airplanes coming from the west, and you see them circling around each other, and then the original airplanes go off further west, and these airplanes from the west come east to attack. Now, that's a crucial piece of information, because it means that, I don't know what happened to the past, they obviously are not alive now, but these were remote control aircraft, and that technology was clearly available to the military at that time, and Lockheed Skunk Works, etc. But that airplane came into the Pentagon, did that 5G turn at low altitude, 500 knots, and came in, and it launched a missile at the Pentagon. Now, only terrorists could not have put a missile on the wing of that airplane, okay? But you can clearly see the missile trail in the Pentagon video. And I'm a military pilot. I've shot missiles off here. I know what that smoke trail looks like, and that's a missile smoke trail. And as the Pentagon video progresses, you see that smoke trail, and then you see this white explosion rise up above the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, when an airplane hits it's black and red, only black and red. There's no white, which is the signature of high explosives. And that's why the military people came out of them and smelled cordite. They smelled high explosives. So that proves that there was a missile that they blew into the Pentagon wall before the plane crashed. Now, being loaded with explosives, that explains why there's no airplane left. No wreckage. It hit the wall, the well hauled like a chance, and then the plane was exploded into confetti pieces. Now, the second interesting thing is there's 3 holes in the Pentagon walls consecutively, 12 feet around, and no airplane wreckage could have done that. Only a missile, special penetrating missile, could have done that. In addition, part of the wreckage found within the Pentagon was half of a radome. A radome is a fiberglass nose of the aircraft. Had it hit an intact wall, that radome would have been okay. But with half a radome inside, it means that there had to be a hole in that wall before the Pentagon plane hit it. That's the only way to explain it. The only way that hole could have got there is that was a missile. Now, why did they throw the missile in? I don't know. But terrorists didn't do that. This was a government black operation.
Here's another question from you. This is Lasha Senyak. Does he think paranoia can be weaponized to control people with fear?
Only if disturbed individuals, and they do tend in mind control experience with the CIA to use abused people and disturbed people, and yes, paranoia can be used to affect them, but they have to use hypnosis as well as drugs in order to affect mind control.
Yes, which happens. I had a DEA agent last night. 95% of the world's drugs are in America.
Yeah, because the CIA is important, letting it happen.
That's right.
And most of them come through Mexico now, by the way. And that was proved by Terry Reid in his book Compromised about the Iran-Contra scandal. CIA. He was a pilot for the CIA. He flew drugs in the United States to Maine, Arkansas.
Oh, yeah. You talking about Barry Seal, Arkansas?
No, not talking about Barry Seal. I'm talking about Terry Reid, who was another pilot, who was then sent by the CIA to take up residence in Mexico, and his first job was to bring a container into the United States, and he opened it out and found it full of heroin. He called the CIA and said, "Hey, this container is full of heroin." They said, "Close it up, don't tell anybody about it, and ship it through."
Huh.
And they take it through Mexican customs where they certify it as drug-free so that the dogs, when they go berserk sniffing them, cannot open it. That's all of his book, Compromised. Very well documented.
Here is another question for you. What are your thoughts on the 5G for military purposes?
Well, this is a very interesting question because I have, and I'm going to be covering this in this next Friday's World Affairs Brief. My son is an electrical engineer who's part of the international consortium of electrical engineers that make the safety rules for 5G. And so he has been compiling for a while all of the views of his various engineers around the world dealing with 5G and things about what are the safety aspects. And it's very interesting. The consensus is, well, we can make the case that either 5G is totally deadly or not very dangerous at all, depending on and how close we get it or how powerful, the radiation is or how close it is and how long it's. And so it's just very, very difficult to make the case that it is being designed by government to kill everybody. That's one extreme. Because it really is a higher frequency, and there is more penetration, but they use because it has more range at less power. It's one of the purposes of going to 5G. The real reason 5G is not necessarily for the nefarious purpose. The real reason is because of the world of connectivity. Everything now is going to be connected by Wi-Fi. Refrigerators, televisions, everything is going to be talking to one another, collecting and surveilling information. And so that's why it takes multiple antennas all around you, all throughout the city. The only real safety from it is to get out of Dodge, to stay out of the big cities, because it's coming. And but it's not necessarily deadly any more than 4G is or 3G. A lot of it depends on how long you put up the transmitter right next to your face, which you shouldn't be doing. You should be using speakerphone or an earbud or something. It's not really deadly unless it's up close and powerful for long periods of time. So avoid the exposure and you'll be okay.
This is why Edward Snowden says that each time he gets an iPhone, he has to dissect it, remove the camera, remove the microphone, and if he wants to make a phone call, he plugs in on, headphones and speakers, so he could speak without being worried that he's being watched.
Yeah. Well, that's why I don't have a smartphone.
Smart, very smart. Now, tell us what else you know. What's in this week's World Affairs brief?
Well, I'm going to have a review of Trump's record, all 3 years of it, all the promises, what's been kept, what he's been able to do, and what he hasn't been able to do, and whether or not it's his fault. And some is, and some isn't. So it's going to be a very interesting read. And I'm also going to be covering, of course, the latest impeachment trials as well, and be covering this issue on 5G and some other technical relations. And also in every World Affairs brief, people get a preparedness tip. My son Andrew writes the preparedness tip, and it's always very informative and one of the most popular aspects of the World Affairs brief. And your listeners can get a free copy of the World Affairs brief by simply emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. It's about $1 to subscribe to the World Affairs brief, which is very inexpensive. But if you want to get a free sample issue, it tells you how to subscribe, and you can read what's coming this Friday.
I'm actually plugging that in right now into the chat. We got 10 minutes left, or maybe a little under. What else do you have to tell us?
Well, let's talk a little bit about Iran. One of the good things that President Trump has done is he's resisted the multiple provocations of the deep state to try to get Iran to retaliate and start a war so that the U.S. can go to war against Iran. It's very interesting. Iran is in the crosshairs of the globalists, has been for many, many years, ever since 2004, because they're the only country trying to become self-sufficient in weapons production. And they're building everything from missiles to satellites to drones to aircraft to tanks to armored personnel carriers, and every other Muslim country is tied to the supply chain of either east or west, and most of it's in the west now, so they can be controlled. Globalists don't want an uncontrolled Muslim country that they, can't use as cannon fodder, and so that's why Iran has to go. They have been using these. You notice there have been riots and protests in Tehran and Iraq, Baghdad, and elsewhere, violent protests. It's not hard to get people to protest because these countries have been under terrific and horrendous sanctions by the United States, which makes for extreme hardship. And the Iranian government had to raise the price of gasoline, which had been highly subsidized for many, many years, about 50%. And it initially caused a lot of protests. But now you have agent provocateurs, I think, and so does Iran, from the West, being sent in to get people to become violent. And they've been attacking banks and businesses. The same thing in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong protesters were friendly. And then the Communist Party sent in agent provocateurs in order to react and to make the protest movement unpopular and to justify a crackdown. In fact, in Tehran, Iran even said that the initial 100 people that were killed were not killed by our security forces. Somebody else was doing the shooting. And that means that someone was out there trying to really provoke and make Iran look bad. Same thing with Iraq. Iraq, they want the U.S. to be determined to keep Iraq destabilized so that they don't kick the U.S. out. This is a very pernicious thing that's going on all around the world, is how the deep state, infiltrates and interferes in elections, starts riots and protests. And even the communists do it too, as we're seeing in China.
Now, what if there was, of all the topics you have in your world affairs brief that we did not talk about, what do you think is the most frightening?
Well, the thing that I want people to be most fearful of, legitimately, is coming World War III. There's a lot of talk about economic collapse. Been going on for 10 years. It still hasn't happened. That's determined by the Federal Reserve, because true economic collapse never happens, by the way, unless you have war. Unless you can go to work, economies don't collapse. They don't collapse even with hyperinflation. They collapse, when social unrest hits, when there's rioting in the streets and you can't go to work. So I don't think that's a big threat. The globalists want you fat, dumb, and happy, clear up in the time the surprise attack comes, so they have the maximum impact, and so that you have the maximum fear and lack of preparedness that's going to happen when the grid goes down. It's going to be very, very bad, and that's why I've written my preparedness book, because I really want people to prepare. I don't have a lot of confidence that anybody's going to be able to take down the deep state, especially Donald Trump, just because he can't. He doesn't know enough about conspiracy to be able to track and what the evidence is. I mean, clearly this is a secret conspiracy. So we're never going to know all that the deep state is doing. But we know enough, and you can track it enough in some of the leaders like Henry Kissinger or George Soros, Brzezinski, and others like that, to watch what's going on. But this stuff is powerful. It's not just a bunch of holdovers from the Obama administration trying to get rid of Trump. This deep state is lethal. They killed presidents. They killed JFK. Killed RFK.
It's funny you mentioned RFK. Our one guest is William Pepper, who is Sirhan Sirhan's attorney.
Great. And he knows that he was set up.
That's right. He said he did not shoot the fatal shots. As a matter of fact, RFK's fatal shots came from behind, where Sirhan Sirhan was in front.
And there were 9 bullets that came out of the cabinetry of that hotel. And his gun only held 6, and they were 22, and there were 38 and 44 and other bullets dug out of the cabinets. That proves that there were other shooters.
Sad, very sad.
This is the deep state we're talking about, people to pick up. What I worry about, Dr. J, is the false hope that you get with someone like Donald Trump, who he's a PR guy, and he claims all these, and everyone loves the claims. You look at his rallies, and he just says the right things. But even I could not probably take down the deep state as much as I know, because you'd have to get evidence against them. The deep state controls the courts. They wouldn't accept it. They'll let them off. The Department of Justice wouldn't prosecute. I mean, how do you get around all these deep state people that are embedded in government? It's just very, very difficult.
You can't. You really can't. What?
So people have to be prepared for what they're going to bring. And they're going to bring war upon this country. I don't think for 5 years. I don't think they're ready their present rate of rearmament until at least the middle of the next decade, and it could be as far as the end of the next decade before they're ready to attack. So you do have some time to prepare, not to go to sleep, but people need to prepare to get their way to what's going on.
Now, what's another important story before we end this show about that's in this either coming World Affairs Brief or this week's World Affairs Brief?
Well, let's see. I've got a big file of stories. The Brexit is being sabotaged as we speak, and it's a very important story.
That's right.
What's happening. They're going to have new elections, etc., and I don't think the Conservatives are going to do very well. Let me see what else we have. talked about the agent marketers in Iraq and Iran.
Yes.
There's also industrial sabotage going on in Iran, just like the Stuxnet virus. And
let me ask you this. How
go
about
ahead.
Jeffrey Epstein and who died, and this new girl, I think it's Virginia, I don't know her last name, has a picture with Prince Andrew, and Prince Andrew says the picture is doctored, and he unequivocally denies it. What kind of BS is that?
That's really BS. He hasn't been kicked out of the Buckingham Palace and the Royals family for nothing. That's true. What he's done. When we have the we have the verbal witness of multiple witnesses of underage girls having sex with Prince Andrew. But Ghislaine Maxwell, by the way, the madam that was running all this prostitution ring for Epstein, she's in
trafficking,
court, and,
not just she was sex trafficking for.
That's right.
Epstein.
That's right. But the court has granted her attorneys stay after stay after stay to continue to delay and delay. I tell you, these courts are really covering up for this thing. And that's why they have never seen the light of day. They've never demanded to see the FBI tapes that they have from Epstein's residences, which have all the pictures of all the heavies around the world having sex with underage people that are prosecutable. And this is a major cover-up, what's going on. I mean, Epstein was running a hooker line for the deep state, basically to get blackmailable material on all these important people. Not that they ever had to use it, because these people are all willingly going along. They've got a promise of immunity, except if they start to buck the system, if they start to get cold feet and want to get out, then they'll bring the blackmail out. But Epstein was rolling in dough, and all that dough didn't just come from Wexner of Victoria's Secret fame. He never engaged in any trading in Wall Street, they said. So a lot of those favored people who came to his resorts were all paying him a lot of money. And it wasn't because of blackmail. It's because, we're supporting the system.
That's right.
Kind of buying our own immunity.
That's right.
Making sure that we aren't prosecuted.
Very sick, very sick. One more story for us, even though we've gone past the time.
Well, I've really covered everything that's going on today.
Okay.
It's going to be a lot of.
Let me tell you this then. Let's talk about what you mentioned, World Affairs Brief, and let's tell people again where they can get it. So people can send an email to editor@worldaffairsbrief.com, right, for the first issue free. And they could also go to worldaffairsbrief.com right now and not see the full stories, but see the headlines.
That's right. And there's also a lot of news stories that we cover at World Affairs Brief every day. And so you can get lots of good things there.
If you have one final statement, Mr. Skousen, what would it be?
Well, I'm saying get prepared for the worst that's coming, because Trump is not going to be able to save us. And I have a feeling that even though I don't think he's going to be convicted for impeachment, it will be damaging enough to his reputation that the polls tend to show that he think he will be defeated, depending on who they run. I don't think any of the people running for president is going to make it, but I think Hillary Clinton's dump her hat in the ring. When there's a contested convention, nobody getting a majority of votes, then she'll rise as the savior.
Yeah, I've heard rumors about her with the running mate of Michelle Obama. What do you think about that?
No, probably not two women. It's probably going to be Buttigieg or somebody who will be a running mate. He's very savvy about the media. The public isn't ready to elect a full homosexual as president, but probably as vice president she could get away with it.
Well, with that being said, Mr. Skousen, I hang by for a second. I want to talk to you afterwards. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed this historical show. First, we had William Pepper, Sirhan Sirhan's attorney, and MLK's friend. 2 assassinations in 2 months. How sad. And then, of course, we bring on the World Affairs Brief, or the Infowars expert on the World Affairs Brief, and it's been a while since I brought him on because I had a backlog of guests, and I'm glad to bring him here. Now, if you want to get a hold of me, Pam Vrettenberg runs my social media. Twitter is the only thing I respond to myself, and also not Facebook, sorry. I also run Minds. I also run Twitter, and or not Twitter, sorry. Twitter, Minds, and YouTube Studios. So every time you write a comment after the show, it's me that's gonna like it or comment on it. That is coming directly from me because I have them installed on my devices. With that being said, folks, remember this was such a great show. Joel will be back with us very soon because I've I've happened to manage to to get a lot of those people that were backlogged in, and now I'm going to resume with Joel coming back every month, which was my plan a year ago. So with that being said, folks, please go to worldaffairsbrief.com or send an email to editor@worldaffairsbrief. And if you know my phone number, call me or tweet me or just write me a comment in Facebook. Everything else is the same name. Everything is the same name, actually. Dr. J Radio Live. DRJ Radio Live. Instagram, Flickr, Tumblr, Facebook, Minds, Google Plus, whatever you think. You can see it right there, folks. So with that being said, we are officially signing